What's going on, y'all? It's your favorite Marvel Snapper, KM Best, here to tell you what changed, what didn't, and how good it is in the latest Marvel Snap patch. The patch notes open with a discussion of recent balance issues, and frankly, I would describe it as an apology. They mention that balance issues affected specifically Season Pass cards in the form of Loki and Elsa, and they note that those cards will be getting further testing in the future. In addition, they've beefed up their internal testing, and they will be doing more to make sure that cards released in a balanced state rather than an overtuned or undertuned one. That said, they do go out of their way to say that they are going to aim, sometimes they're going to aim high and they're going to miss, but they do explicitly say they will not aim high with the express purpose of nerfing it later. They will not be doing what they said they may be doing in the Mobius Nerf patch notes. And they do specifically address those patch notes, which I've made a video about already. They say, basically, they misspoke. And, take that for what it's worth. But what they say is that they misspoke, and that what they're trying to get across is that, yes, when we released Mobius, we aimed high, and then our internal data showed that he had a very negative impact on the early to mid Pool 3 experience, and so we overreacted by nerfing him the way that we did. And by the time the nerf actually came out, then they were very confident that they could revert the nerf, and they're now trying to do that with this patch. Now, this is, it's kind of everything I asked for, but I understand there's going to be people out there who just are not satisfied with this. That people for whom the patch notes that came out with Mobius, that you can't write that away by saying it was an accident. And I think it's reasonable to approach this from a perspective of what I would describe as cautious optimism, where it's like, okay, you reverted the biggest mistake, which is deleting the card people paid for. You get points for that. You announced that you were reverting the mistake in order to preempt people purchasing SheHulk bundles under false pretenses. You get points for that. You announced that you think Loki and Elsa were significantly bad balance decisions, and you say you are going out of your way to mitigate those in the future. You get points for that. And I think that generally speaking, as long as they hold up their end of the bargain, I'm cool with it. My issue would come in terms of I know there are going to be people out there for whom they will never believe this ever. There are going to be people out there in the world who simply will not ever believe that this is a thing that will actually happen. Those people have already made up their mind that after the Mobius nerf, or maybe even before the Mobius nerf, that this is not a trustworthy company. And if you are one of those people, I encourage you to play a different game. Sincerely, I know that sounds pithy, but if you don't trust the developers to not milk you for money, I would suggest playing a different game, because there needs to be some level of trust with where your money is going. For me, I buy this, I think. I believe that this is a reasonable explanation for what has happened over the past few months. They whiffed Loki, they whiffed Elsa, they saw internal data on Mobius that looked terrible, they wrote a statement that sucked. Okay, I buy that. Okay. But I do need to see some evidence of that process bearing fruit. You can fix the process mistakes all you want, but if you don't fix the end result, if we don't get some seasons without Lokis or Elsas, and to be clear, Miss Marvel, definitely not one of those, so I guess points for that. But we need to see a sustained period of time without those kind of misses. And I think that that would be something that the game would benefit heavily from. Now, I also want to jump into this discussion of actual Mobius, who is now back at his old ability, but at a 3-cost, 3-power slot. And I think a lot of people are severely overreacting to this card. I think the 3-cost slot makes him legitimately difficult to play. For example, decks like Thanos really won't want to fit this guy in, because Thanos is all about playing a stone and a 2 on the 3rd turn in order to accelerate into 5-cost cards. Decks like Darkhawk, it now conflicts with Rock Slide, for example, the typical mid-range type stuff. So I wonder if it'll have to be some sort of new style of deck. I will note, Spectrum was buffed recently. There is something to be said for that. Miss Marvel just came out. There might be something to be said for that as well. But it has to be a deck that is like actively interested in playing Mobius, and it also has to be a deck that needs to tech against Loki. And I think that's actually an interesting spot to be in. So a lot of people are going to be like, okay, this kills negative, this kills Sarah. And I think the actual impact it'll have is it'll just make those decks harder to queue up with, right? When I think about what Mobius will do, it won't kill the win rates of those decks, but it'll negatively impact the play rate just by existing and hovering in people's, like, I don't know, hovering in people's inner ear when they imagine what playing this deck will be like. Instead of imagining, oh, I'm gonna pop off, they imagine, oh, they play Mobius and then I die. Like, it limits the range of the imagination with decks like Sarah, with decks like Negative. But I do think that that is a, I guess, reasonable price to pay. I do think there are going to be plenty of people who are like, well, Loki is the actual problem and they should do something about that. And to those people, I say, I agree with you. I do think they should probably do something about that card at some point. I think it is a little bit too strong, even as a 4/5. I'm sure they're waiting on data, but at a certain point, I do think it will become sort of incontrovertible, even though Loki is traditionally not very powerful at low ranks. The Mobius change might not even be the craziest change in this patch. ShangChi is finally getting a nerf that people have legitimately been asking for since the beta. It used to be kind of a joke. I remember there was a Twitch stream that famously had like an exclamation point Shang command, which was someone arguing that ShangChi needed a heavy nerf, and that was like, the point was that it was a joke. Like, it was something to point and laugh at. Be like, ShangChi needs a nerf. What is this Reddit dork on? And it turns out what that Reddit dork was on was being correct. ShangChi has long deserved some sort of balanced attention, and I think this is an interesting way to do it, and a lot smarter than a lot of community suggestions and my own suggestions, which are like, oh, why don't we just like make him a 4/2? I think this is a good balanced lever to twist on him. Making him only hit things that are 10 power or higher means that 9 power suddenly becomes a very interesting slot for units to go into, the same way that 8 power currently is. A lot of what makes Vision relevant in the current metagame is that he's an 8 power card, which is exactly enough for him not to be Shang-Chi'd. Now suddenly there's more room for them to play around with 5s, which in turn actually adds more room for them to play around with 6s. By making Shang-Chi hit 10 plus, it sort of lets them stretch out what the acceptable range of power is, both for 5s and 6s. Because if 5s are now, 5/9 is now like uncounterable, right? What if Vision was a 5/9, right? I mean, obviously they probably wouldn't do that, but like, what if a card that had like a slightly worse effect than Vision came out as a 5/9? And then you start thinking, all right, so what does that do to 6-cost cards? Suddenly you got thinking like, okay, what if Magneto was like a 6/13? Like, I feel like this almost adds a whole new number to how they like Hulk could be a 6/13, right? Like, it adds a little bit. It gives a lot of interesting design abilities to the team, and I think that's probably a good thing, because 6-cost cards and 5-cost cards in Marvel Snap have traditionally been pretty limited, honestly. Like, basically every good 5-cost card is just a card you play in Thanos. And a lot of the good 6-cost cards, it's like Doom, Eliath, Chavez kind of stuff. And it's speaking of Chavez, she won't die to this anymore, by the way. Kind of interesting. And I think that's like the main place that we'll see this take effect in the future. But one of the places that we'll see it immediately is, you know, Killmonger type stuff might be a little more important, maybe, because Shang-Chi is no longer going to be a reliable big guy cleanup thing. I think there's also going to be like, you know, your Angelas, your Bishops, your Collectors. You're going to want to keep them. You get a little bit more wiggle room with them now. So it's like a bit of a stealth buff to those Scalers, which are very rarely reaching 10 anyway. And Werewolf by Night, interestingly, now you can leave it at 9 instead of leaving it at 7. Previously with Shang-Chi at 9, hitting things that are 9, you had to leave Werewolf by Night at 7 in order to avoid getting Shang-Chi'd, but now you can leave it at 9. You will not get Shang-Chi'd, so it's a little bit of a buff to Werewolf by Night. That said, the Mobius returning to the metagame is a little bit of a nerf to Werewolf by Night, because it makes you less incentivized to include something like Beast or Quinjet in your deck, both of which are in most Werewolf by Night decks, or, you know, one of which is at least in most Werewolf by Night decks. And that is an interesting turn as well. So Shang-Chi in his new form, I don't expect there to be much of a drop off in power, but I do expect people to like temporarily take a step back and be like, okay, what am I actually hitting with this? How many things am I actually killing with this? What things now fit under the Shang-Chi breakpoint? Do I actually need to run this card? I think this is a great nerf. I'm really excited to see what it does. Alongside Shang-Chi, they made a couple changes to make sure certain cards could and could not be hit by Shang-Chi. So the first of those is SheHulk, going up to 10 power again. Now she is Shangable once more, and she gets that power back that she lost before Mobius came out, back when Wave could be still used in conjunction with her ability. Boy, what a time that was. This is a kind of a nothing burger to me. I don't think it does much. I don't think it changes much for She-Hulk. I wouldn't really be interested in playing too many She-Hulk decks, but I wasn't before. And so there's basically a lot of nerfs in Marvel Snap that I think could be reverted along the lines of this one, where they were changed in a different metagame, and now they're in a different place. And the place that they're in, it's like, why did we nerf them in the first place? Because context has changed so dramatically. And I think She-Hulk is just one of those, so I would be really interested in them going back and checking the backlogs of changes they've made and really sort of auditing it and being like, do we really have to do this? Especially for those cards in Series 3, Series 2, and Series 1, which are the more free-to-play cards in the game. Warpath also getting a little bit of a buff, but of course enough to go into Shang-Chi range. Now he's going to be a 4/10 as long as one of your other lanes are empty, making him a very interesting counterpart to Namor. Warpath and Namor, I mean, you kind of can only play in one lane there, but still, it's kind of interesting. And they specifically call out the interplay of Warpath and Shang-Chi in the early pool in the nerf notes here, because what they wanted to get at is playing a card in another lane to dodge your opponent's Shang-Chi is a cool learning moment, and they wanted to keep that intact. In addition, they also raised the monster from Monster Island. That is going to be a 6/10, so it remains Shang-Chi-able. I remember back in the day, Monster Island was one of the first, I believe, featured/hot locations. Shang-Chi was the card to play. It was everywhere, and luckily, he will still maintain that functionality. Jessica Jones getting a little bit of a buff here. Just getting an extra power, making her effectively a 4/9, pretty sick, actually, unshangable, and very, very strong for a 4-cost card. Like, this is legitimately one of the stronger 4-cost cards in the game right now. It's rescue, but better, I think, in a lot of situations at this point, because of the way the timing works. It's a very, very powerful card right now. I honestly kind of want to know what Jessica Jones will do in a future metagame. There's a lot of Storm decks running around right now, thanks to Ms. Marvel. Jessica Jones could be a player there. That said, she's tended to be a bit fringy. We'll see if this buff can make her a real threat. If this buff had happened a few months ago, I would have told you this makes Move legitimately good. Strange going to 2/3 is such a phenomenal buff for this card, because one of the issues that Move tends to have is that their turn 5s are really weird, and they often end up being like 3+2. And if that 2 could be Doctor Strange, we could be in a really interesting spot with Move. Unfortunately, a lot of those turn 5 plays were predicated on wave stuff. That's a bit tough right now, now that she no longer does what she used to when I was originally advocating for Doctor Strange to be a 2/3. That said, Doctor Strange is an ability that is extremely powerful in Move decks and extremely unique. So I'm glad that they took this route as opposed to like fully reworking him, just buffing him a little bit and seeing if that gets his ability played more. He's a really, really strong card right now, I think. Like, that is a really interesting ability, and it might legitimately be good enough in Move decks to be something real. I don't know how good any Move deck can be, but 2/3 Doctor Strange should get those gears in your brain moving, because I honestly think the power level in Marvel Snap outside of Loki is relatively low, and Move is one of those decks that can really put a beating on Loki, because you Loki into a bunch of crap that you can't really use well. It's an interesting proposition. I don't know if I'm going to be the person to go that direction, but I know there are people out there watching this whose wheels are spinning right now. Finally, in a touching moment for the KMBest channel, Strong Guy is getting a buff, and I'm really happy about this. Strong Guy is the guy I named my account after in Marvel Snap. It's been my name for a few months now, and I could not be more honored to see my namesake getting a solid improvement. Like, he's going to be a 3-9, legitimately a 3-9 if you can turn him on, which makes him an absolute early pool powerhouse when you can play stuff like, Strong Guy into Khazar, into Blue Marvel, into your entire hand of 1-drops on the final turn. There are a couple of drawbacks, though. Things you can't do with him. Apocalypse. That's bad because he's a discard synergy card. America Chavez, because you're going to need to get her out of your hand somehow. So unless you're playing like a card specifically with the idea of discarding your Chavez, and it's hard to do that profitably on the final turn of the game unless you go like Sarah into Lady Sif Ghost Rider. It just becomes a whole thing. So this guy kind of wants to go into a sort of final turn stat dump Sarah deck. We'll see how viable that kind of stuff is in a post Mobius world, because again, he is a lot worse than he used to be. Mobius, I mean. So it might not be a thing, but I'm happy they're playing around with Strong Guy. I'm overjoyed they're playing around with the early pool cards again. And I think at least in the early pools where people can play Zoo, this guy's a legitimate threat again. And I think that's just phenomenal. He was one of my favorite cards when I first started playing the game. He remains one of my favorite cards. I'm pretty sure I have an infinite avatar of this guy. So believe me, I'm happy to see this change. And 3-9, that's honestly nothing to laugh at. People talk about Werewolf being a 3-9, a 3-11. I mean, this guy won't be 3-11, but 3-9 ain't bad. It really is not. So a ton of stuff happened this patch, and I think I generally just want to get your opinion. Anyone who watched this far, first of all, thank you. I really appreciate it. And second of all, this is where I normally ask you, like, okay, what do you think about X? Leave it in the comments below. But I want to be a little bit more straightforward here. Do you think that their apology and explanation for the past 2 months was acceptable to you? I know there are going to be people out there for whom the answer is absolutely not. They lost it. And I know there are going to be people out there who are like, yes. So I kind of want to know if you could like leave a comment telling me if you think the apology and explanation makes sense to you and whether or not you plan on continuing to play the game. I know that consumer confidence has been significantly damaged by this. I know mine was. And I'm just sort of interested to see how everyone else is feeling. Because one of the things about being a content creator is you are by definition kind of a whale, right? And so my opinions are by definition kind of whale, high invested player opinions. And I think it's always good to try to get out of my bubble just a little bit and ask y'all what you think. So please let me know in the comments. I still read every single one. As always, I've been KMBest. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. I will see you in the next one.